The morning sun cast long shadows across the Texas plains as Jed Holbrook limped toward his ranch house, his weathered hands gripping the worn wooden porch railing. The familiar creak of the boards beneath his boots stopped abruptly when he saw them 5 young Comanche women sitting motionless on his porch, their dark eyes watching him with a mixture of fear and determination. His hand dropped instinctively to the Colt .45 at his hip, his fingers closing around the familiar grip as his heart hammered against his ribs. Every instinct screamed danger. These could be a trap, a distraction while warriors surrounded his home. But as his eyes took in their torn deerskin tunics, the bruises marking their faces the way their shoulders sagged with exhaustion, his hand slowly relaxed. These weren't warriors, they were survivors. The eldest, perhaps 25, wore a distinctive silver pendant that caught the morning light, a pendant that made Jed's blood run cold as he recognized it. Behind the women, his ranch house door stood slightly ajar, and the acrid smell of smoke still lingered in the air from his burned barn, a blackened skeleton against the orange sky. Lord Almighty. He whispered, his voice barely audible, as the weight of an impossible situation settled on his shoulders. His carefully constructed solitude was about to be shattered forever, and he had no idea what these women wanted or why they had chosen his doorstep. 3 days earlier, Jed Holbrook had been a different man. At 42, his sandy hair was streaked with premature gray, and his left leg bore the permanent reminder of a cavalry charge at Gettysburg that left him with a pronounced limp. But his blue eyes remained sharp, his draw was still quick, and his small ranch in the valley between Cedar Ridge's low hills had provided him with 8 years of healing solitude. The ranch sat 15 miles from town, connected to civilization, by a single dirt road that wound through stands of mesquite and limestone outcroppings. A creek ran behind the house, fed by springs that bubbled up from deep underground, before meandering through patches of sandy soil and sparse grass. The house itself was modest, 2 rooms, a kitchen, and a root cellar that his late wife Sarah had insisted on for storing vegetables. He'd kept it exactly as she'd left it, down to the blue checkered curtains she'd sewn by hand. Sarah and their young son Tommy had been killed in a Comanche raid 8 years past. But the tragedy had taught Jed something unexpected about himself. Where others found hatred, he'd found only a hollow ache. Where others demanded revenge, he'd chosen to honor Sarah's memory by living according to her teachings. A person's worth shows in how they treat folks who can't do nothing for them, she used to say while tending to injured animals or feeding drifters who came to their door. That's the measure of a soul, Jed. Not what they can take, but what they're willing to give. The people of Cedar Ridge didn't share his philosophy. To them, the ongoing conflicts between settlers and the Comanche were a matter of survival, and anyone who showed mercy to Indians was a fool asking for trouble. Mayor Buchanan, a portly man who'd made his fortune selling supplies to homesteaders, regularly organized hunting parties to track down any Comanche who ventured too close to town. He'd grown wealthy on the fear and conflict that kept settlers buying guns, ammunition, and provisions. Sheriff Hayes, a former Confederate officer with a handlebar mustache and a taste for whiskey, enforced Buchanan's unofficial policies with brutal efficiency. The law in Cedar Ridge was whatever Buchanan said it was, and what Buchanan said was that Indians were vermin to be exterminated. But Jed had seen enough killing. He'd fought in the war, watched good men die for principles they barely understood, and come home to find his family murdered. Someone had to step away from the violence, and he decided it would be him. On that Tuesday morning, as he rode out to check on his cattle grazing near the creek, Jed had no idea that his moral convictions were about to be tested in ways he couldn't imagine. The creek ran clear and cold where it curved around a cluster of cottonwoods, creating a natural pool that his cattle favored during the scorching Texas summers. Jed had guided his horse, a sturdy quarter horse named Buck, along the familiar path when he spotted something that made his throat tighten with dread. A man lay crumpled among the rocks at the water's edge, his body twisted at an unnatural angle. Blood had pooled beneath him, turning the sandy soil dark red and attracting flies that buzzed in the morning heat. At first glance, Jed thought it might be one of his neighbors, perhaps thrown from his horse during a river crossing. But as he dismounted and approached, his assumptions crumbled. The man wore distinctive buckskin clothing decorated with intricate beadwork, his long black hair was braided with feathers, and his weathered copper skin marked him unmistakably as Comanche. This wasn't just any warrior. Even unconscious and bleeding, the man carried himself with unmistakable authority. His clothing was finer than most, decorated with silver ornaments that spoke of high rank within the tribe. A war chief's regalia. Around his neck hung a pendant of hammered silver, its surface etched with symbols that seemed to tell a story of battles fought and victories won. The man had been shot twice, once in the shoulder, where bone showed through torn flesh, once in the thigh, where blood continued to seep steadily. The wounds were recent, probably within the last few hours. Pink foam bubbled from his lips, suggesting internal bleeding that would prove fatal without immediate treatment. Jed knelt beside the unconscious chief, checking for a pulse. It was weak but steady. The man's eyes fluttered open, revealing dark brown irises filled with pain and a fierce intelligence that immediately assessed Jed as a potential threat. "Easy there," Jed said softly, raising his hands to show he meant no harm. "You're hurt bad." The chief's lips moved, but no sound came out. His eyes darted toward the hills where dust clouds suggested approaching riders. Then his gaze fixed on Jed's face. Something passed between them, a moment of desperate communication between two men who understood that death was approaching fast. "Gray Fox," the chief whispered, touching his own chest. His English was heavily accented but clear. "I am Gray Fox." Jed had heard the name whispered in saloons and spoken in fear around campfires. Gray Fox was the war chief of the Southern Comanche band, known for his tactical brilliance and his attempts to negotiate peace with the territorial government. He was also worth a $1,000 bounty, dead or alive, posted by men who saw profit in continued warfare. "Who did this to you?" Jed asked, though he already suspected the answer. Gray Fox's eyes closed, his breathing becoming more labored. "Buchanan's men," he gasped. "They came while I watered my horses. Said they knew where to find me." His eyes opened again, fixing on Jed with surprising intensity. "But I was careful. Someone told them exactly where I would be." The dust clouds were getting closer. Jed could hear the distant sound of horses and men shouting, a posse from Cedar Ridge, no doubt tracking the wounded chief. If they found Jed with him, they'd assume he was in league with the Comanche. At best, he'd be arrested as a traitor. At worst, he'd be shot on sight. Every instinct told him to walk away, to let nature take its course. Gray Fox was dying anyway, and getting involved would only bring trouble. But as he looked at the chief's face, twisted with pain, but still dignified, he saw not an enemy, but a human being in desperate need. Sarah's voice echoed in his memory. "That's the measure of a soul, Jed. Not what they can take, but what they're willing to give." "Damn it all," Jed muttered, making a decision that would change everything. He slipped his arms under Gray Fox's shoulders and knees, lifting him with a grunt of effort. The chief was heavier than he looked, and Jed's bad leg protested with every step as he carried him toward Buck. "This is gonna hurt," Jed warned, hoisting the unconscious man onto the horse's back. Gray Fox groaned, but didn't wake up fully. Jed mounted behind him, holding the chief steady as he guided Buck toward home through increasingly rough terrain. The ride back to the ranch took 20 minutes through landscape that shifted from the creek's sandy bottom to rocky ground scattered with prickly pear and yucca. They passed through a narrow canyon where the creek had carved its way through limestone, then up onto higher ground where twisted mesquite trees offered sparse shade. Every second felt like an eternity, as Jed kept expecting to hear gunshots, to feel a bullet tear through his back. They made it to the ranch without incident, and Jed quickly carried Gray Fox into the house. The root cellar was the only hiding place that made sense. It was cool, dark, and accessed through a trap door in the kitchen floor. Jed had Sarah's old medical supplies down there, bandages, laudanum, carbolic acid. He'd learned field medicine during the war, and while he was no doctor, he knew enough to keep a man alive. As he worked to clean and dress Gray Fox's wounds, Jed tried not to think about what he was doing. He was harboring a fugitive, a wanted man, whose capture would bring glory and money to whoever turned him in. But every time he considered stopping, he remembered Sarah's words about the measure of a soul. By the time he finished bandaging the chief's wounds, the sun was setting, and Jed could hear riders approaching the ranch. He quickly closed the trap door, covering it with a throw rug and a kitchen chair. Then he grabbed his rifle and stepped out onto the porch to face whatever was coming. The riders emerged from the evening shadows like harbingers of violence, their horses snorting and stamping in the dusty yard. Mayor Buchanan led the group, his bulk straining against his vest, his usually jovial face set in hard lines. Behind him rode Sheriff Hayes, Deputy Morrison, and 6 other men Jed recognized from town store owners, ranchers, and drifters who'd been recruited for the hunt. "Evening, Jed." Buchanan called out, his voice carrying false friendliness. "Fine evening for a ride." Jed kept his rifle lowered but ready. "Little late for social calls, ain't it, Mayor? We're tracking a dangerous fugitive." Sheriff Hayes interjected, his hand resting on his pistol. "Comanche war chief named Gray Fox. He's wounded and desperate. You seen anything suspicious?" The lie came easier than Jed expected. "Can't say I have. Been working on the north pasture all day. What's he done?" "Attacked a survey party this morning." Buchanan set his eyes, scanning the ranch buildings with predatory interest. "Killed 2 innocent men in cold blood. We tracked him this far, but the trail goes cold at your creek." Jed knew it was a lie. Gray Fox had been in no condition to attack anyone when he'd found him. More likely, Buchanan's men had ambushed the chief while he was watering his horses, then invented a story to justify their actions. "Well, he ain't here," Jed said firmly. "You're welcome to search the barn if you want." "We'll do that," Hayes said, dismounting with deliberate slowness. "Morrison, take 3 men and check the outbuildings. I'll search the house." "The hell you will," Jed said, raising his rifle. "You got no warrant, and this is private property." The tension in the yard ratcheted up immediately. Several of the men reached for their weapons, but Buchanan raised a hand to stop them. "Now, Jed, there's no need for hostilities," the mayor said smoothly. "We're just trying to protect the community. You understand that, don't you?" "I understand you're on my land without permission," Jed replied. "And I understand you're accusing me of harboring a fugitive without a shred of evidence." "Your sympathies for the red man are well known," said Tom Patterson, one of the store owners. "How do we know you didn't help him?" "Because I'm telling you I didn't," Jed said, his voice rising. "And a man's word used to count for something in this territory." The standoff stretched on for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. Finally, Buchanan seemed to realize that pushing further would likely result in bloodshed, and he wasn't quite ready for that step. "Search the barn," he ordered Hayes, "but leave the house alone, for now." The men spent the next hour going through Jed's outbuildings, finding nothing but disturbing his horses and scattering his tools. All the while, Jed stood on his porch, rifle in hand, knowing that Gray Fox lay unconscious just a few feet below the kitchen floor. When they finally mounted up to leave, Buchanan rode close to the porch. "This ain't over, Jed. That savage is somewhere nearby, and when we find him, we'll remember who helped and who didn't." "You do that," Jed said. "And remember this, I've never broken a law in my life, and I don't plan to start now." After the posse disappeared into the darkness, Jed went back inside and checked on Gray Fox. The chief was conscious now, his dark eyes alert and watching. "Thank you," Gray Fox whispered. "Why did you help me?" It was a simple question with no simple answer. Jed sat heavily in a chair beside the trapdoor, suddenly feeling every one of his 42 years. "Because leaving you to die would have been wrong," he said finally. "My wife used to say that how you treat folks who can't help you shows what kind of person you are." Gray Fox nodded slowly, then winced as the movement caused him pain. "They will come back. With more men, more weapons." "I know," Jed said. "Which is why you need to get back to your people as soon as you can travel." 2 days, Gray Fox said. "Give me 2 days to heal enough to ride." Jed looked at the chief's bandaged wounds, at the pale cast to his skin, and wondered if 2 days would be enough, but he nodded anyway. 2 days, he agreed. "But after that you're on your own." Gray Fox's eyes held a strange intensity. "Perhaps. But if something happens to me, if I do not return to my people, they will know what to do." "What do you mean?" "I have preparations, contingencies. A leader must always think ahead, must always have plans within plans." Gray Fox's voice carried a weight that suggested deeper meaning. Sometimes the greatest victory comes from apparent defeat. The first day passed quietly enough. Jed went about his normal routine, feeding the cattle, mending fences, checking the water levels in the creek, while Gray Fox rested in the root cellar. The chief's condition improved steadily, and by evening he was able to sit up and take some broth. That night, as Jed sat by the cellar entrance, Gray Fox told him about the attack. He'd been returning from a failed peace negotiation with the territorial governor when Buchanan's bounty hunters had ambushed his small party at the creek. 3 of his warriors had been killed, and Gray Fox had barely escaped with his life. "Your mayor, Gray Fox," said, his voice filled with bitter knowledge. "He makes money from war. Every gun sold, every wagon of supplies, every family that needs protection, he profits from fear." Jed had suspected as much. Buchanan's business thrived on the conflict between settlers and Indians. Peace would ruin his income. "What about your people?" Jed asked. "What will they do when you don't return?" Gray Fox's eyes took on a distant look. "My daughters, my nieces, they have been trained for such possibilities. They know the locations of our hidden supplies, the names of our allies, the plans for survival. If I fall, they will ensure our people endure." There was something in his voice, a hint of deeper planning that Jed didn't fully understand. But before he could ask more questions, Gray Fox had closed his eyes and drifted off to sleep. The second day brought clear signs of trouble. Jed woke to find his cattle scattered across the valley and his barn door standing open. Someone had been on his property during the night, and they'd made sure he knew it. Painted on the side of his house in white letters 3 feet high were the words, "Indian Lover." More disturbing were the signs of watchers in the surrounding hills. Jed caught glimpses of reflected sunlight, probably from spyglass lenses, and twice he saw dust clouds that disappeared when he looked directly at them. He was being watched, and his watchers weren't trying very hard to hide themselves. That afternoon, while Jed was repairing damage to his fence, a lone rider approached from the direction of town. It was Father Miguel, the elderly priest, who served the small Catholic community in Cedar Ridge. The priest was one of the few people in town who'd never questioned Jed's reluctance to join the Indian hunting parties. "Good afternoon, Jed," Father Miguel said, dismounting from his mule. "I've come to offer you fair warning." "About what?" "Buchanan's been stirring up the town against you. He's convinced half the people that you're working with the Comanche. There's talk of burning you out." Jed felt his stomach tighten. "When? Tomorrow night, maybe the next. He's waiting for the right moment when he can claim you brought it on yourself." Father Miguel's weathered face creased with concern. "Jed, if you're hiding something now, would be the time to make it right." For a moment, Jed considered telling the priest everything. Father Miguel was a good man, and he'd proven his discretion over the years. But involving him would only put another innocent person at risk. "I appreciate the warning, Father," Jed said. "But I haven't done anything wrong." "I know that," the priest said. "But right and wrong don't always matter when fear gets its claws into people. Watch yourself, son." After Father Miguel left, Jed went inside and found Gray Fox sitting up in the cellar, his back against the stone wall. The chief's color had returned, and his breathing was stronger. "It's time," the chief said. "I can travel now." "It's still daylight," Jed protested. "They'll see us." "Tonight, then, after the moon sets." Gray Fox's eyes met Jed's, with an intensity that was almost unsettling. "But before I go, you must understand something. What you have done may have consequences you cannot imagine." "What do you mean?" "The debt between us goes deeper than simple gratitude. In my culture, when a man saves a chief's life, it creates bonds that extend beyond the two individuals involved. My people will remember what you have done, and they will honor it." Jed felt a chill of premonition. "I don't want anything from your people. I just wanted to help." "I know," Gray Fox said. "But sometimes what we want and what we receive are different things. Be prepared for that possibility." As darkness fell, Jed prepared Buck for the journey. Gray Fox had insisted on bringing his own horse, a magnificent paint stallion that had somehow found its way to the ranch during the night. The chief's recovery was remarkable, whether from natural resilience or sheer force of will. He was now able to walk without assistance, though he still moved carefully. They set out at midnight, following the creek north toward the hills where Gray Fox's people made their temporary camps. The journey took them through terrain that grew increasingly rough, rocky draws carved by flash floods, stands of oak and mesquite, that offered both cover and concealment, patches of sandy soil that muffled their horses' hoofbeats. The landscape changed as they climbed higher, the creek becoming a series of pools connected by rocky streams, the vegetation shifting from desert scrub to scattered pines. Jed's knowledge of the terrain proved valuable, as he was able to guide them around the most treacherous spots where loose rock could cause a horse to stumble. Halfway to their destination, they encountered Gray Fox's scouts, two young warriors who materialized out of the darkness like spirits. There was a brief tense moment when the warriors raised their weapons, but Gray Fox spoke quickly in Comanche, and they lowered their arms. The reunion was emotional, but brief. Gray Fox embraced his men, spoke rapidly in their native tongue, then turned to Jed with a formal expression. "You have given me my life," he said. "This creates obligations that must be honored." "No obligations," Jed replied. "Just one human being helping another." Gray Fox studied him for a long moment. "You do not understand our ways. A life saved creates bonds that cannot be broken. What happens in the days to come will test those bonds in ways you cannot imagine." Before Jed could ask what he meant, Gray Fox had mounted his horse and disappeared into the darkness with his warriors. Jed was left alone with Buck, the sound of his own breathing, and the growing certainty that his troubles were far from over. He was right. When he returned to the ranch at dawn, he found his barn consumed by flames and his remaining cattle scattered across the valley. Written in the dirt of his yard in large letters were the words, "Last Warning." Jed stood in his doorway, watching his life's work burn, and wondered if saving Gray Fox had been worth the cost. The answer came to him as he remembered the chief's words about bonds that cannot be broken. Some things were worth any price. For 2 days after Gray Fox's escape, Jed lived in a state of suspended animation. His barn was gone, his cattle scattered, and his credit in town had been cut off. No one would sell him supplies, and the few neighbors who might have helped him were too afraid of being labeled Indian sympathizers themselves. He spent his time repairing what he could and staying alert for signs of further trouble. The watchers in the hills had vanished, but Jed didn't trust the apparent calm. In his experience, stillness often preceded the most violent storms. On the third morning, while he was trying to patch a hole in his roof, he noticed something strange in his yard. Near the gate, almost hidden in the tall grass, was a Comanche arrow. But this wasn't a weapon. It was a message arrow decorated with specific patterns of beadwork and feathers that held meaning for those who knew how to read them. Jed had learned some Comanche customs during his travels before the war, and he recognized this as a token of gratitude. The arrow was acknowledgement of a debt, a formal recognition of the obligation Gray Fox felt he owed. It was also a promise the Comanche would remember both kindness and treachery. That night, as Jed sat on his porch cleaning his rifle, he heard sounds in the distance. Horses, many of them moving fast across the desert. Gunfire echoing off the hills. Screams carrying on the wind. The sounds of battle came from the direction of the Comanche camp. A running fight that seemed to move across the landscape like wildfire. He stood up, straining to hear more clearly. The sounds continued for nearly an hour, then gradually faded into silence. Jed went inside and barricaded his door, knowing that whatever was happening out there would affect him whether he wanted it to or not. He woke the next morning to find the 5 women on his porch. At first, in the confusion of sleep and surprise, his hand moved instinctively toward his gun. But as his eyes focused, he realized they were real, and they were in terrible condition. His heart hammered as he took in their torn clothing, the bruises on their faces, the way they held themselves with dignity, despite their obvious desperation. The eldest, perhaps 25, wore the silver pendant he'd seen around Gray Fox's neck. Her name, she would tell him, was Ayana, which meant eternal blossom in Comanche. She had the bearing of someone accustomed to authority, with intelligent dark eyes that seemed to assess everything at once. Beside her sat Kestrel, no more than 16, with the quick alert movements of her namesake bird. She spoke little English, but her eyes held a fierce determination that reminded Jed of Gray Fox himself. The others, Lara, Dove, and Willow, ranged in age from 18 to 22. All were injured to some degree, their faces marked by exhaustion and recent violence. But their eyes held the same proud bearing that seemed to be a family trait. "You are the one," Ayana said in careful English, touching the pendant at her throat. "The one who saved Gray Fox. I helped a wounded man," Jed said cautiously, his pulse still racing from the shock of finding them. "Nothing more. Gray Fox is my father," she continued. "These are my sisters and cousins. We have nowhere else to go." The words hit Jed like a physical blow. Gray Fox's daughters. The chief had sent his own family to the man who'd saved his life. The implications were staggering and terrifying. Well, what happened? Jed asked, though he dreaded the answer. Buchanan's men came at dawn with soldiers and Texas Rangers. Ayana said, her voice tight with controlled emotion. "They attacked our camp while most of our warriors were away." Kestrel spoke in rapid Comanche, her young voice breaking with emotion. But there was anger there, too, a cold fury that suggested this girl would not forget what had been done to her people. Ayana translated her own voice, becoming harder with each word. "She says they killed everyone they could find. The old people, the children, the women who couldn't run fast enough. They burned our lodges and scattered our horses." "How many survived?" Jed asked, feeling sick. "Of our band, perhaps 20. The rest?" Ayana's voice trailed off. "And Gray Fox. Alive, but separated from us in the fighting. He sent us here because he said you were the only white man who could be trusted." She paused, studying Jed's face. "He said you would understand what it means to honor a debt." But even as she spoke, Jed could see something else in her eyes, a wariness that suggested she wasn't telling him everything. More troubling was the expression on Lara's face. The young woman seemed uncomfortable, her gaze darting between Jed and the others, as if she were wrestling with some internal conflict. "There's more to this," Jed said. "Something you're not telling me." Ayana exchanged glances with her companions. "In our culture, when a man saves a chief's life, the debt can only be repaid with something of equal value." The implication hit him like a thunderbolt. "You're not just refugees seeking shelter. We are what our father offered as repayment for his life, Ayana said quietly. But we are also free to choose our own path. The thought horrified Jed. He had no desire to own women, to treat them as property to be traded like cattle. But he also understood that refusing them outright would be seen as an insult that could turn Gray Fox from an ally into an enemy. I don't want repayment, he said firmly. I want to help because it's the right thing to do. Then help us as people who need help, Ayana said, not as payment for a debt. But Lara had been listening to this exchange with growing agitation. Now she spoke up, her voice sharp with suspicion. How do we know he won't betray us? She said in English that was more fluent than she'd initially let on. How do we know this isn't a trap? Ayana's expression tightened. We have discussed this, sister. Have we? Lara's voice grew stronger. Or have you simply decided for all of us this white man could turn us over to the soldiers for bounty money? He could. She paused, her eyes filling with remembered pain. He could do worse things. Jed realized that Lara's suspicion came from bitter experience. She had seen what white men could do to Indian women, and she wasn't about to trust easily. What would convince you that I mean no harm? He asked gently. Lara looked at him for a long moment, then spoke in rapid Comanche. Ayana's face darkened as she listened. She says that in her experience, white men who help Indians always want something in return. Ayana translated. She fears that you are simply waiting for the right moment to collect your payment. What payment would that be? Lara met his eyes for the first time since arriving at the ranch. Your people take our land, our horses, our lives. What else is there but our bodies and our dignity? It was a devastating question, and Jed found himself thinking about it seriously. What did he want from this arrangement? The women's assumption about traditional payment sickened him. But was there something else, some deeper need that he was trying to fill? I want to prove that not all white men are the same, he said finally. I want to show that it's possible to choose decency over hatred. Lara studied his face, searching for signs of deception. Words come easy when there's no cost. We'll see what you do when the cost gets high. The first week passed in a strange routine of adjustment and growing tension. The 5 women proved to be remarkably resilient, adapting to their new circumstances with a pragmatism that impressed Jed. They helped repair the damage to his ranch, cooked meals with the limited supplies he had left, and quietly prepared for the trouble they all knew was coming. Ayana emerged as their natural leader, serving as translator and negotiator between her younger companions and their reluctant host. She was also the most skilled in English, having learned it from her father's dealings with traders and government officials. But it was their knowledge of warfare that surprised Jed most. When he mentioned the need to better defend the ranch, Ayana calmly began discussing fields of fire, defensive positions, and escape routes with the tactical knowledge of a seasoned warrior. Even Kestrel, despite her youth, demonstrated an understanding of military strategy that rivaled that of veteran soldiers. Your father trained you well, Jed said to Ayana one evening as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the desert in shades of gold and crimson. He trained us to survive, she replied. In a world that wants to destroy us, survival requires more than just courage. It requires planning, Jed said, and the willingness to do what must be done. She said, her voice carrying a weight that made Jed look at her more carefully. It was then that he noticed Lara standing in the doorway, her expression still troubled despite the week they'd spent together. Throughout that time, she had been the most withdrawn of the women participating in the daily routines, but holding herself apart from the growing sense of unity. Lara, Ayana said in English, clearly intending for Jed to understand. Come sit with us. The younger woman approached hesitantly, her eyes still wary. I've been thinking, she said in careful English, about what happens when the soldiers come. When they come, we'll be ready, Ayana said. Will we? Lara's voice grew stronger. This man has shown kindness, yes. But kindness doesn't stop bullets. And when the shooting starts, how do we know he won't hand us over to save himself? Jed found himself caught in the middle of a family argument that went deeper than simple tactics. Lara's doubts weren't just about military strategy. They were about trust, about whether a white man could truly be counted on when the stakes were highest. "What would convince you?" he asked. Lara met his eyes directly. "Time," she said simply. "Time and seeing what you do when everything's at risk." But even as she spoke, Jed noticed that Dove seemed agitated, her eyes darting nervously between the others. The youngest of the cousins had been quiet all week, but now she looked like someone wrestling with a terrible decision. "Dove," Ayanna said gently. "What troubles you?" Dove spoke in rapid Comanche, her voice shaking. Ayanna's expression darkened as she listened. "What is it?" Jed asked. "She's afraid," Ayanna said. "She wants to leave before the soldiers come. She thinks we should surrender, that it would be better to face captivity than death." "And what do you think?" Jed asked. Before Ayanna could answer, Lara spoke up. "I think she's scared. And I think fear makes people do foolish things." She fixed Dove with a steady gaze. "Like running to the soldiers and telling them where we are." Dove's face went pale. She spoke rapidly in Comanche, her voice rising with emotion. "She says she would never betray us," Ayanna translated. "But she's terrified of what will happen if we stay. Terror can make people do things they never thought they would." Lara said grimly. "I've seen it happen." The peace of that moment was shattered by the sound of approaching horses. Jed counted at least a dozen riders moving at a steady pace toward the ranch. He grabbed his rifle and motioned for the women to get inside. "Stay low and stay quiet," he warned. "Whatever happens, don't show yourselves unless I give the word." The riders were led by Sheriff Hayes, but this wasn't the same group that had searched the ranch a week earlier. These were harder men, Texas Rangers, bounty hunters, and drifters who made their living with their guns. They formed a semicircle around the ranch house, their weapons clearly visible. "Jed Holbrook," Hayes called out. "You're under arrest for harboring fugitives and giving aid to enemies of the state." "What fugitives?" Jed replied, keeping his rifle ready while his heart hammered against his ribs. "Don't play games with us, Holbrook. We know you've got them Comanche women in there, the ones that escaped from the camp we cleaned out. So much for keeping their presence secret. Someone had been watching more carefully than Jed had realized." "I don't know what you're talking about," Jed said, but he knew it was a weak lie. "Search the house." Hayes ordered his men. "You still don't have a warrant," Jed said. "Don't need one for known fugitives," Hayes replied. "Now step aside or we'll move you aside." Jed knew he couldn't fight a dozen armed men and win. But he also knew that if he stepped aside, the women would be killed or worse. The Rangers weren't known for their mercy when it came to Indians. "I'm not moving," he said. "Then you'll die where you stand," said a voice from the group of riders. The speaker was a tall, lean man with a black beard and cold eyes. Jed recognized him as Captain Mitchell, one of the most feared Ranger commanders in Texas. "Maybe," Jed said, his mouth dry with fear, "but I'll take some of you with me." It was a standoff that could only end in bloodshed. The Rangers began to spread out, preparing for a fight, when a new voice cut through the tension. "Stop." Ayanna stepped out of the house, her hands raised to show she was unarmed. Behind her came the other 4 women, all walking with dignity, despite their desperate circumstances. "We are here," Ayanna said in clear English. "But we are not fugitives. We are survivors of a massacre, and we claim the right of sanctuary." Captain Mitchell laughed harshly. "Sanctuary, you're savages. You don't have rights. But we have the right to live," Ayanna replied. "And this man has given us shelter as any decent person would." "Decent," Mitchell spat. "You heathen devils murdered innocent people." Jed watched the confrontation with growing dread. He could see the Rangers' hands moving toward their weapons, could feel the violence building in the air like pressure before a storm. "Hey, Captain," he said, stepping forward. "These women are under my protection. If you want them, you'll have to go through me. That can be arranged?" Mitchell said, his hand dropping to his pistol. But before he could draw, Ayanna spoke again, her voice carrying a new authority. "Captain Mitchell," she said, and the Ranger's eyes widened with surprise that she knew his name. "You killed my cousin in the raid on our camp. His name was Swift Arrow, and he was only 14 years old." "I've killed a lot of Indians," Mitchell replied. "I don't remember their names." "You should," Ayanna said, "because he was carrying a white cloth trying to surrender when you shot him." The accusation hit the group like a physical blow. Even some of the Rangers looked uncomfortable. Killing warriors in battle was one thing, but murdering children who were trying to surrender was another. "You're lying," Mitchell said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Ask your men," Ayanna replied. "They were there. They saw what you did." Jed watched the Ranger's face change as doubt crept in. The accusation had shaken Mitchell's confidence, and in that moment of uncertainty, Jed saw his chance. "Sheriff Hayes," he said, addressing the local lawman rather than the Ranger captain. "These women are accused of no crime. They're refugees, not fugitives. What law says you can arrest them?" Hayes shifted uncomfortably in his saddle. "Well, they're Indians. They're people," Jed said firmly. "And unless you can show me a specific law they've broken, you've got no right to arrest them." It was a long shot, but it worked. Hayes was a political animal, and he knew that arresting innocent women without cause could create problems for him later. "We'll be watching," Hayes said finally. "All of you. One false move and we'll be back." "You do that," Jed said. "And make sure you bring a warrant next time." The confrontation ended without immediate bloodshed, but Jed knew it was only a temporary victory. Mitchell's parting glare promised that this wasn't over. After the riders disappeared, Jed turned to find Lara watching him with a different expression. The suspicion was gone, replaced by something that looked like grudging respect. "You stood with us," she said quietly. "When it mattered, you stood with us." "I gave my word," Jed said simply. "Words are easy to give," she replied. "Much harder to keep when your life depends on it." That night, as Jed made his rounds checking the ranch's defenses, he found Dove waiting for him by the corral. She looked terrified, her hands shaking as she clutched a small bundle. "I was going to leave," she said in halting English. "I was going to tell them where you were." Jed felt his blood run cold. "Why?" "Because I was scared," she said, tears streaming down her face. "I thought if I helped them, they might let me live. But Lara, she talked to me. She made me understand that there are worse things than dying." "What changed your mind?" "You," she said simply. "The way you stood up to them knowing they could kill you. I've never seen a white man do that for Indians before." The attack came 3 nights later, under a moonless sky that turned the desert into a landscape of shifting shadows. Jed had been expecting it, but the reality was more terrifying than any nightmare. The first sign of trouble was the smell of smoke, not the clean scent of a cooking fire, but the acrid stench of burning wood soaked in coal oil. Jed bolted upright in his bed, reaching for the rifle he kept beside him. Through his window, he could see orange flames dancing in the darkness where his remaining outbuildings stood. "They're here," he shouted to the women who had been sleeping in the main room of the house. "Get to the positions we discussed." The women moved without panic, each taking her assigned role in the defense plan they had worked out. Ayanna and Kestrel took positions at the front windows, while Lara and Dove covered the back of the house. Willow, despite being the youngest, was responsible for reloading weapons and carrying messages between the positions. The first wave of attackers used the flames from the burning buildings as both light and distraction. Jed counted at least 15 men, all moving with the coordinated precision of experienced fighters. They had learned from their previous encounter this time. They weren't taking any chances. Smoke from the fires began to drift toward the house, carried by the desert wind. It stung Jed's eyes and made it difficult to see clearly, turning the approaching figures into indistinct shapes that seemed to dance in the flickering light. "Right there," Ayanna called out, pointing to movement near the burning tool shed. 4 of them using the smoke as cover. Jed swung his rifle toward the shadows and fired. One of the attackers stumbled and fell, but the others kept coming. The first shots were followed immediately by the crash of breaking glass as bullets shattered the windows. Net movement on the east side. Lara shouted from her position. "They're trying to circle around." The second wave was more systematic. The attackers had spent time observing the ranch's layout, and they used that knowledge to deadly effect. Rifle fire from multiple directions forced Jed and the women to take cover behind overturned furniture and the thick adobe walls. A bullet whined past Jed's head so close he felt the heat of its passage. He ducked lower behind the table he was using for cover, his heart pounding as he tried to count muzzle flashes. Too many. Far too many. "We're surrounded," he called out to the women. "They've got us pinned from 3 sides. Then we make them pay for every inch." Ayanna replied, her voice steady despite the chaos around them. A bullet struck the wall above Dove's head, showering her with adobe dust. She cried out in fear, but kept her position, her hands shaking as she reloaded one of the rifles. "I'm hit." Lara called out, her voice tight with pain. "It's just a graze on my arm, but I'm bleeding." Jed felt his own arm burning where a bullet had creased him, but he ignored the pain. Blood was seeping through his shirt, making his grip on the rifle slippery. The third wave was a direct assault on the house itself. Captain Mitchell kicked in the front door, his pistol blazing as he charged into the main room. Behind him came 3 more men, all firing as they advanced through the smoke and chaos. "You should have minded your own business," Mitchell shouted over the gunfire. Jed met them with his rifle, but the space was too confined for accurate shooting. Within seconds, the fight had devolved into brutal, hand-to-hand combat. Jed grappled with Mitchell, while the women engaged the other attackers with knives and makeshift weapons. Mitchell was younger and stronger, his muscles corded with the power of a man who had spent years fighting for his life. He forced Jed back against the wall, his knife getting closer to its target with each passing second. "This is for harboring savages." Mitchell snarled, trying to drive his blade toward Jed's throat. Jed managed to grab the ranger's wrist, but his strength was ebbing fast. The wound on his arm was bleeding freely, and he could feel his grip weakening. Mitchell's knife inched closer, the blade gleaming in the firelight. In desperation, Jed thought of Sarah, of the promise he'd made to live by her principles. He thought of the women who had trusted him with their lives, and somehow found the strength to shove Mitchell backward. But the ranger recovered quickly, lunging forward with renewed fury. This time Jed wasn't strong enough to stop him. The knife sliced across his ribs, sending fire through his body. He stumbled, his vision blurring, as blood loss took its toll. It was then that Kestrel appeared at Mitchell's shoulder. Throughout the week, the youngest woman had been quiet and seemingly fragile, but now she moved with deadly purpose. In her hands was Jed's spare rifle, and her finger was on the trigger, but she hesitated. For a crucial moment she stood frozen, the weight of taking a life warring with the need to protect her family. Her young face was streaked with tears and soot, her hands trembling as she struggled with the decision. "Swift Arrow," she whispered, and Jed could see the memory of her murdered cousin in her eyes. "This is for Swift Arrow." The rifle shot was deafening in the confined space. Mitchell staggered, looked down at the spreading stain on his shirt, and crumpled to the floor. His death threw the remaining attackers into panic, and within minutes, the surviving rangers were fleeing into the darkness. By dawn, the battle was over. The ranch was heavily damaged with most of the outbuildings destroyed and the house pocked with bullet holes. Smoke still drifted from the smoldering ruins, and the smell of gunpowder hung heavy in the air. Jed sat on the porch steps, his wounds bandaged with strips torn from Ayanna's dress. His arm throbbed with every heartbeat, and the cut on his ribs felt like a line of fire across his body. But they had survived, and their enemies had been defeated. Kestrel sat beside him, staring at her hands, as if she couldn't quite believe what she had done. She had barely spoken since the battle ended, and her young face was haunted by the knowledge of what she had become. "You saved our lives," Jed said gently. "I killed a man," she replied, her voice hollow. "I've never killed anyone before." "You did what you had to do," Jed said. "Sometimes that's all any of us can do." "Will the dreams ever stop?" she asked. "The dreams where I see his face." Jed thought about the men he'd killed during the war, and the way their faces still visited him in the dark hours before dawn. "I don't know," he said honestly. "But I hope they do. And I hope you never have to make that choice again." A week after the battle, Gray Fox arrived at the ranch with a small band of survivors. The chief looked older, his face lined with grief and exhaustion, but his eyes still held the fierce intelligence that had made him a respected leader. "My daughters," he said simply, embracing Ayanna and the others. "You are safe." "We are more than safe," Ayanna replied. "We are home." Gray Fox studied his eldest daughter's face, seeing the changes that the past weeks had wrought. Then he turned to Jed, and the two men regarded each other with new understanding. "You have honored the debt," Gray Fox said. "But there is something you must know. Something I have not told you." Jed felt a chill of premonition. "What is it?" "The attack on your ranch, the way you found me by the creek, the arrival of my daughters at your door. None of it was entirely accidental." "What do you mean?" Gray Fox's expression grew grave. "I had been watching you for months before our meeting. I knew of your losses, your character, your refusal to let hatred consume you. When my scouts reported Buchanan's plans to attack my people, I knew I needed to find allies among the whites." The implications hit Jed like a physical blow. "You let me find you. I chose to trust you with my life," Gray Fox said carefully. "And when I knew my people would be scattered, I sent my daughters to you, not just for protection, but as a test." "A test of what?" "Of whether you would truly stand with us when the cost became unbearable. Whether you would choose principle over safety, honor over survival." Jed felt anger rising in his chest. "You used me. You put your daughters at risk to test my character." "I gambled everything on your character," Gray Fox replied. "The knowledge they carried the plans for our survival, the future of our people. I entrusted it all to you. It was the greatest risk I have ever taken. You could have told me the truth. Would you have acted differently if you had known? Would you have stood as firmly against Mitchell and his men?" Jed considered the question, then slowly shook his head. "No, I would have done the same thing." "Then you understand why I could not reveal the full truth. Some tests can only be passed by those who don't know they are being tested." But it was what Gray Fox revealed next that truly explained everything. The women had not just been sent for protection, they had been carrying vital information about the tribe's hidden supply caches, the locations of other bands, and the plans for regrouping after the expected attack. "You see," Gray Fox said, "I knew Buchanan would not be satisfied with simply driving us away. He would want to destroy us completely to eliminate any possibility of our return. So I prepared for that possibility. By risking your daughters' lives, by ensuring our people's survival," Gray Fox said firmly. "My daughters understood the risks. They chose to take them because they knew what was at stake." Ayanna spoke up for the first time since her father's arrival. "We were not just refugees seeking shelter, Jed. We were guardians of our people's future. and we chose to entrust that future to you." 2 weeks after Gray Fox's return, a federal marshal arrived at the ranch carrying news that would change everything. The survey party that had supposedly been attacked by Gray Fox's warriors, the incident that had started the whole chain of events, had been found alive and well in El Paso. They confessed everything. The marshal explained, his weathered face grim with disgust. Buchanan paid them to disappear for a while to give him an excuse to organize hunting parties against the Comanche. The whole attack was staged. "What happened to Buchanan?" Jed asked. "He's been arrested and charged with fraud, conspiracy, and inciting violence against peaceful Indians. The territorial government has issued a formal apology to the Comanche people and authorized substantial compensation for the families of those killed in the raid." The marshal pulled out a document and handed it to Jed. "You've been officially recognized as a liaison between the territorial government and the Comanche bands. They're offering you a position helping to negotiate a permanent peace treaty. And if I refuse, then you keep running your ranch and living your life. But the offer stands if you ever change your mind." 2 years later, Jed stood on his porch watching the sun set over the valley. The ranch had been rebuilt and expanded with new buildings that reflected both white and Comanche architectural traditions. The corrals held horses that were the finest in the territory bred, using methods that combined the best of both cultures. Ayanna approached from the house, carrying their infant son, a child, who represented the future they were building together. She had become not just Jed's wife, but his partner in every sense of the word, helping to run the ranch and serving as a bridge between the white and Indian communities. "The territorial governor is sending a delegation next month," she said, settling beside him on the porch. "They want to discuss expanding the peace treaty to include all the remaining Comanche bands." "What does your father think?" "He thinks it's the beginning of a new era. The old ways of constant warfare are ending, but something better is taking their place." Their son gurgled happily in Ayanna's arms, his dark eyes bright with curiosity about the world around him. Gray Fox often visited to tell stories to his grandson, tales of both Comanche and white history, that would help the boy understand the heritage he carried from both sides. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if things had been different?" Ayanna asked. Jed considered the question. If he hadn't found Gray Fox by the creek, if he hadn't made the decision to help despite the risks, if he hadn't stood up to Mitchell and his men, how different would their lives have been? "Sometimes," he said. "But I can't imagine being anywhere else than right here with you and our son." And the other women had indeed found their own paths. Kestrel had married a young Mexican vaquero who worked on the ranch, and they were expecting their first child. She had grown into a strong, capable woman, though she still sometimes woke from nightmares about the battle. Lara had become the ranch's chief horse trainer, her initial suspicions of Jed long since replaced by fierce loyalty. She had never married, preferring to dedicate herself to the work of building the bridge between the two communities. Dove had overcome her early terror and become one of the most effective ambassadors between the scattered Comanche groups and the growing settlement. Her near betrayal had taught her the value of courage over safety. Willow had surprised everyone by pursuing an education, studying with Father Miguel, and eventually becoming a teacher who worked with both white and Indian children. She had established a small school near the ranch that served families from both communities. "They all found their places," Jed said, "just like we did." And Buchanan, he's serving 10 years in the territorial prison. The judge said he was lucky not to be charged with murder for the people who died because of his lies. As they sat together on the porch, watching the stars emerge in the darkening sky, Jed reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. It had begun with a wounded man, by a creek, and a decision to act with compassion rather than hatred. That choice had led to love, to family, to a community that was slowly healing the wounds of a divided land. The ranch was quiet now, and the sounds of the day giving way to the peaceful chorus of night. In the distance, Jed could see the lights of several small settlements where white and Indian families lived and worked together. It wasn't perfect, and there were still those who opposed what they were trying to build. But it was a beginning. "Tell me about the old days," their son would say someday, when he was old enough to understand the story of how his parents had met and fallen in love in the middle of a war. And Jed would tell him about the 5 women who had appeared on his porch carrying the future of their people, about the battles they had fought and the peace they had won, about the way understanding could grow in the most unlikely places when people chose to see each other as human beings rather than enemies. The story was complete. Now every question answered, every conflict resolved. The ranch would continue to grow and prosper, serving as a symbol of what was possible when people chose hope over fear, trust over suspicion, and love over hatred. And at its heart would always be the memory of that morning when a cowboy chose to save a stranger's life, and how that choice had changed everything.